desolate travelers. Tonight, we tell the entire story of the Denali Coven, the oldest vegetarian vampires in the world. A family forged not from blood, but from choice. Shaped by centuries of grief and devotion in the frozen wilderness of the far north. So, get cozy. Pull the blankets close. And let the quiet of Denali carry you gently into sleep. The land came first. Before the coven, before the choice. Before the centuries of quiet and grief and hard-won peace. There was the land itself. Alaska, as it exists now, is a named and measured thing, divided into boroughs and marked on satellite maps, its coastlines documented, and its mountain ranges catalogued with the confident precision of a civilization that believes naming something is the same as understanding it. But the land the Denali sisters chose was ancient, long before anyone thought to name it. The permafrost beneath its surface had been frozen for thousands of years. A memory of ice ages preserved in the earth itself, indifferent to every season that passed above it. The spruce forest had grown and burned and grown again in cycles that made human history seem like a brief interruption in something much longer and much less concerned with human meaning. The rivers ran cold and clear through valleys that had never heard a human voice raised in anger. Only in the low, careful tones of people who understood that the wilderness did not belong to them, that they belonged to it, and that the difference mattered enormously. The sisters understood this too. It was part of why they stayed. Tanya found the territory first, in an era so distant that the people who would eventually call themselves Athabascan were still learning the particular rhythms of this specific landscape, still mapping in their collective memory the locations of the best fishing grounds and the safest winter camps. She had been moving for decades before she arrived here, drifting across the continent that would someday be called North America, following no particular path and obeying no particular logic beyond the restless need to keep moving that had characterized her early immortal centuries. She had seen extraordinary things in those wandering years. She had watched human civilizations rise and consolidate and collapse in the eastern regions of the continent. She had seen forests so dense that the canopy blocked the sky entirely, and plains so vast that the horizon seemed to curve with the shape of the earth. She had moved through all of it without stopping, drawn forward by something she could not name with precision and could not satisfy with distance. Not safety, exactly. Vampires did not need safety in the way humans did. Their bodies were not vulnerable to the ordinary dangers of wilderness living, to cold or exposure or the violence of large animals. Not beauty, though the landscape offered it in extraordinary abundance at every turn. Something closer to quiet. Something that matched the particular stillness she carried inside herself. The settled quality that had been part of her nature even before her transformation. and had deepened considerably after it. She had always been someone who needed space around her thoughts, room for the interior life that mattered as much to her as any external circumstance. The crowded, nomadic patterns of most vampire existence left no room for that. She needed somewhere that was genuinely still. She found it here, in the shadow of the great mountain the Athabascan people call Denali, the High One, the Great One. The mountain dominated the landscape with the absolute authority of something that had existed before anything alive and would continue to exist after everything alive was gone. Its upper slopes were lost in cloud on most days, a deliberate concealment that made the mountain seem even larger than it was, a presence that withheld itself even as it defined everything around it. Standing at its base on a clear winter night, looking upward past the tree line to where the permanent snowfields began, Tanya felt something she rarely felt in those early restless centuries of her immortal life. She felt small in a way that was comforting rather than diminishing. The mountain did not care what she was. It did not flinch from her stillness or her coldness, or the faint wrongness that made humans uneasy in her presence without quite understanding why. The mountain simply was, as she simply was, and there was a profound and unexpected peace in that shared indifference to category and consequence. She stood there for 3 full days before she moved again. Then she went to find her sisters. Kate came first, following the particular thread of connection between them that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with shared history. They were not sisters in any human biological sense. They had not been born to the same mother, had not grown up in the same household, had not shared the ordinary intimacies of childhood that bind human siblings together across a lifetime of small moments. Their sisterhood had been made rather than born, constructed from decades of shared existence and mutual choice, from the slow accumulation of moments in which they had each decided again and again, and then again, that the other was worth staying for. That kind of sisterhood, chosen and maintained against the natural centrifugal force of immortal existence, was in many ways more durable than the biological kind. It had been tested by circumstance and had held. That was all the proof either of them needed. Kate listened to Tanya describe the territory and said very little, which was her way. She asked 2 or 3 precise questions about the hunting and the human population density and the proximity to the nearest established trade routes. And when Tanya had answered them all satisfactorily, Kate packed what she carried with her and followed her sister north without further deliberation. This too was her way. Kate had always been someone who gathered exactly the information she needed and then acted on it cleanly, without the extended deliberation that characterized Tanya's decision-making or the emotional processing that characterized Irina's. She saw clearly, and she moved. It was a quality that had served her well across centuries and would continue to do so. Irina came last, as she often did, arriving weeks after Kate, with a particular quality of lateness that was never carelessness, but always something more internal, as though she needed more time to complete whatever interior conversation preceded her outward movements. She was quieter than her sisters in a way that was different from either of their quietnesses, where Tanya's stillness was chosen and deliberate and Kate's was simply natural, the default expression of a personality that had no interest in unnecessary noise. Irina's quiet had always carried something more fragile inside it, something that needed protecting. She had been this way since long before any of them could remember clearly, since the earliest years of their shared existence, and her sisters had long since stopped trying to change it and simply arranged themselves around it with the instinctive accommodation of people who love someone exactly as they are. She looked at the mountain and looked at her sisters and said nothing for a long time. Then she sat down in the snow without any apparent concern for the cold she could not feel, drawing her knees up and looking out across the frozen valley below them. And after a long while she said that she thought they might stay here for a very long time. She was right. They stayed for centuries. The life they built in the Denali wilderness was unlike anything most vampires of their era would have recognized as a life at all. The dominant mode of vampire existence was nomadic and predatory, moving through human populations with the efficiency of any apex predator, feeding where the feeding was good, and moving on before the trail of unexplained deaths could accumulate into a pattern visible enough to draw dangerous attention. Even vampires who maintained a degree of what might loosely be called civilization, who fed with some degree of selectivity rather than pure abandon, operated fundamentally as hunters passing through a world that existed primarily as prey. The idea of remaining in one place, of building something permanent, of developing relationships with the landscape and the human communities nearby that were something other than predatory. This was not how vampires lived. The Denali sisters were attempting something different, something that most of their kind regarded as eccentric at best and genuinely incomprehensible at worst. They were choosing to stay. They were choosing to build. And most significantly of all, they were choosing, with deliberate and sustained effort, not to hunt the humans whose world surrounded theirs. The choice had roots that went deep, deeper than the Northern Territory, and deeper than the decades the three of them had spent together. The full weight of that choice, the grief and the guilt, and the fierce, determined love that lay beneath it, like bedrock beneath permafrost, belonged to a story that would come later, to a name that none of them could speak without something cracking open in all three of them simultaneously. For now, in those early centuries in the north, the choice expressed itself in practical terms. They hunted the wildlife that filled the Alaskan wilderness in extraordinary and almost overwhelming abundance. Caribou moved across the tundra in herds that seemed to have no edges, rivers of antler and breath and hoofbeat that stretched from horizon to horizon during the great migrations of late summer and autumn. A single herd could take 3 days to pass a given point, and the sisters learned to track their movements across the seasons with the patient accumulated knowledge of predators who had been studying the same prey across generations. Brown bears fished the salmon rivers in late summer, enormous and unhurried, so confident in their own power that they barely registered the presence of the sisters observing them from the tree line. The bears were harder to hunt than the caribou, more dangerous in a technical sense, though danger was a relative concept when you were what the sisters were. Hunting bears required a particular kind of focus and commitment. Kate hunted them most often, drawn to the challenge of it, to the physical engagement that caribou simply did not provide. Wolves ranged across territories that overlapped extensively with the sisters' own, and the relationship between the two groups developed across the centuries into something that could not quite be called friendship, but but was considerably more than mutual tolerance. The wolves were not prey. They were too close to the sisters in certain essential qualities, too intelligent, too oriented around loyalty and family, too aware of the sisters in ways that suggested something beyond ordinary animal instinct, to be treated as simply food. The sisters left the wolf packs alone. The wolf packs in turn seemed to understand something about the sisters that other animals did not, and while they never approached, they also did not flee. Over time, across the slow accumulation of seasons and years, they learned each other's territories and rhythms and kept a wary, respectful distance that neither species felt the need to violate. The animal blood was never fully satisfying. This was simply the truth of it, the physical reality that no philosophy could wish away, and no amount of commitment could fundamentally alter. Human blood called to every vampire who had ever been transformed, called with a persistence that was woven into the deepest biology of what they had become, present in every moment of every day, regardless of how recently they had fed or how carefully they had constructed their thinking around the alternative. Animal blood dulled the thirst. It sustained the body. It allowed clarity and function, and the ability to exist among humans without the constant strain of acute deprivation. But it did not silence the deeper call, and the ache of that permanent incompleteness was simply the price of the life they had chosen. They accepted it the way a person accepts a scar, as something real and permanent that no longer required constant attention, but was always there when you looked. What the diet returned to them was harder to quantify, but no less real in its way. It returned the humans of the region to the category of people rather than prey. The Athabascan peoples, and later the Denali and the other indigenous nations whose territories bordered and overlapped with the sisters' wilderness, knew that something unusual inhabited the far reaches of the landscape. Stories accumulated across generations, passed down through oral traditions that the sisters occasionally caught fragments of when they moved close enough to human settlements to listen. Stories about pale women seen at the edges of the forest in winter, moving across the snow with a speed that left no tracks. Stories about voices heard in the darkness beyond the firelight that were too beautiful to belong to anything human. Stories that accumulated and shifted and became mythological across the generations, the specific details softening into archetype, the particular becoming universal. The sisters allowed the stories to grow. They were careful to maintain enough distance that the mythology never collapsed back into something specific enough to be dangerous, never became a pattern of sightings precise enough to prompt organized investigation. But they did not try to erase their traces entirely, partly because complete invisibility was practically impossible across centuries of continuous habitation, and partly because there was something they valued in being known, even if only in this indirect and distorted way. Being known, even as legend, was preferable to being entirely absent from the world's awareness. The broader vampire world reached them in irregular pulses. Nomadic vampires passed through the territory occasionally, drawn by curiosity about the unusual reputation of the Northern Sisters, or simply following the hunting across a continent that offered vast and largely uninhabited ranges. These encounters were almost always managed with careful courtesy. The sisters were not aggressive toward other vampires who observed basic protocols of territorial respect, and in return, Most visiting nomads were sufficiently impressed by the Denali Coven's evident stability and size to maintain similar courtesy. The Volturi knew of them, as the Volturi knew of every vampire coven anywhere in the world that had achieved a degree of permanence and visibility. The ancient rulers in Volterra regarded the Denali sisters' dietary choices with a mixture of mild bewilderment and pragmatic approval. The approval winning out because vegetarian vampires created fewer exposure incidents, and fewer exposure incidents simplified the enforcement work that was the Volturi's primary preoccupation. The relationship was stable and careful and entirely devoid of warmth. The sisters found their way to a genuine family with different covens, different souls, in different years. The house they maintained evolved across the centuries from something rudimentary to something that bore the unmistakable quality of a home deeply inhabited across a long span of time. It was set back from every trail, reached by paths that wound through old-growth spruce in configurations designed to discourage casual exploration without appearing deliberately obstructed. Inside, it accumulated the evidence of centuries of continuous living. Books in more languages than most human scholars would encounter in a lifetime. Instruments in various states of use and preservation. Objects of beauty and historical significance collected across half a millennium of human artistic production. There was no bedroom because none of them slept. There was no kitchen because none of them ate. But there were spaces designed for reading and for music and for the long conversations that centuries of shared existence inevitably produced. Conversations that circled back on themselves and developed new dimensions and never quite reached conclusions because the people having them had unlimited time and no particular need to resolve anything. The aurora came in winter, when the nights extended into something vast and absolute, when the darkness lasted long enough that even beings who did not experience it as threatening felt its particular weight. The light moved across the sky in curtains of green and occasionally violet, folding and dissolving and reforming in patterns that were never quite repeated. The sisters watched it with the quality of attention that only long familiarity combined with genuine wonder can produce, something beyond simple observation, and something short of the overwhelming response it might produce in a human seeing it for the first time. They had watched it for centuries. It had not become ordinary. This was one of the things Tanya held on to most deliberately across the long years, returning to it consciously in moments when the weight of immortal existence pressed too heavily. The world retained the capacity to astonish. The aurora was still beautiful. The mountain was still immense. The first clear, cold night of autumn still carried something in the air that was worth breathing slowly and paying attention to. They were the original family of the North. They were ancient and deliberate and shaped by choices that had cost them more than most of their kind would have been willing to pay. They had a philosophy and a home and each other, which was more than most immortals managed across the span of a century, let alone the span of many. But before any of this, before the home and the philosophy and the centuries of chosen family, there was the wound from which all of it grew. There was a woman named Sasha who had loved her daughters into existence and then loved too carelessly in another direction entirely. There was a small and beautiful and utterly impossible child, and there was a night when the Volturi came north, and everything that followed from it, That is where the true story of the Denali Coven begins. Before there was a coven, there was a creator. Her name was Sasha, and she had been alive in the vampire sense for longer than the sisters could fully account for. Her origins belonging to an era so distant that even her own memories of it had softened at the edges, worn smooth by the passage of too many centuries to keep sharp. She was Eastern European, in the way that the land itself was Eastern European. Not a political fact, but a geographical one. Something in the quality of her stillness that suggested long winters and dark forests, and the particular fatalism of people who have learned that beauty and suffering are not opposites, but companions. She was not cruel. This is important to understand before anything else about her is understood, before any judgment is formed about the choices she made and the consequences that followed from them. Sasha was not a cruel creature. She was warm in the way that certain immortals manage to remain warm despite everything the transformation took from them, despite the thirst and the isolation and the long, slow erosion of connection that characterized most vampire existence across the centuries. She had kept something human in herself, or something that functioned like the human qualities she had once possessed, and she spent it freely and without calculation on the being she chose to love. She transformed Tanya first. The precise circumstances belonged to Tanya alone, held in that private interior space that even centuries of sisterhood did not automatically grant access to, and Tanya had never offered the details to anyone who asked directly or approached the subject with a kind of careful indirection that suggested they wanted to know without wanting to ask. What was known, what had always been understood among the sisters without requiring explicit statement, was that Sasha had not transformed her carelessly or for convenience, or out of any predatory calculation about what use a companion might serve. She had transformed her because she saw something in the young human woman that she could not bear to watch the world extinguish in the ordinary way that the world extinguished all human things, slowly and then completely, leaving nothing behind but the memory of what had been there. That was Sasha's pattern, the through line visible across her entire long existence, if you stood far enough back to see the shape of it. She loved particular people with a specific and consuming intensity, saw something irreplaceable in them that she could not accept losing, and when the prospect of losing it to ordinary human mortality became too large to accommodate, she acted. Whether this impulse was generosity or selfishness or some inextricable combination of both was a question none of the sisters had ever fully resolved among themselves. And perhaps the truest answer was that it was both simultaneously, as most profound acts of love tend to be when examined honestly enough. Kate came next, years later, transformed under circumstances similarly held private and similarly rooted in Sasha's particular brand of devoted and slightly reckless impulsiveness. And then Irina, youngest of the three in the order of their making, if not always in the manner of their feeling or the weight of their presence. 3 daughters across what must have been the span of several human generations, each chosen with the same fierce specific recognition, each brought into immortal existence by the same pair of hands and the same overwhelming certainty that they were worth keeping at any cost. Sasha was their mother in every way that the word could be stretched to cover something this far outside its ordinary meaning and its ordinary context. She taught them to hunt in those early bewildering months after transformation. First, with the efficient directness of a predator who had been doing it for centuries and saw no reason to be precious about the instruction. And then, with increasing attentiveness, as she observed her daughters developing their own distinct relationships to the thirst and its particular demands on each of them, she taught them the performance of mortality, the careful assembly of human habits and human mannerisms that allowed vampires to exist alongside human populations without triggering the instinctive wrongness recognition that humans experienced around their kind. That sense of something being not quite right that they could rarely articulate, but that could accumulate into dangerous attention if it was allowed to. She taught them the history and the geography of the vampire world, the loose and largely unwritten traditions that governed how their kind related to each other and to the human world around them. And she taught them about the Volturi, about the ancient rulers in Volterra, whose authority extended across every vampire on Earth, whether those vampires acknowledged it or not, about the laws they enforced and the absolute consistency with which they enforced them. She was thorough in this particular instruction. She took it seriously and communicated its seriousness clearly. She wanted her daughters to understand that the Volturi were not a theoretical threat or a distant abstraction, but a real and present force whose attention was something to be avoided with careful and sustained effort. The irony of that thoroughness, given what came later, was something the sisters would spend a very long time not examining directly. For centuries, the four of them moved together through the world with the particular cohesion of a family that has been tested repeatedly and has held each time. They were nomadic in those early years, before the North called them into permanence and gave their wandering a destination, following the movements of human civilization at a careful remove, present enough to exist in the world in a meaningful sense, and distant enough to survive in it safely. They argued sometimes, as any family argues across the long, compressed intimacy of shared existence, and their arguments had the particular texture of immortal disagreements. They could not storm away and return after a night's sleep with the edges softened by fatigue and the unconscious reset that mortality provides. They had to work through things in real time, without the merciful interruptions and the biological pressure toward resolution that human relationships could rely upon. Over centuries, this necessity made them extraordinarily good at resolution and extremely familiar with each other's particular patterns of conflict and reconciliation. It was not always comfortable knowledge, but it was deep, and through all of it, Sasha loved them, steadily and without reservation, and with the particular expressiveness of someone who had decided, somewhere in the long span of her existence, that love withheld as a form of self-protection was not love at all, but only its cautious shadow. She never told them about Vasily. The child's name was Vasily, and he had been perhaps 5 years old in human terms when Sasha found him, though the precise circumstances of their encounter were details she carried entirely alone, never shared, never offered even in fragments to the daughters. She had told nearly everything else. What she kept from them was not the child's existence exactly. It would have been difficult to keep a secret of that magnitude from 3 vampires who knew her as well as they knew themselves. But rather, she kept him geographically separate, maintaining him in a location far enough from her daughter's awareness that the ordinary proximity and attentiveness of their shared life did not accidentally expose what she was doing. She understood, on some level, that operated alongside and beneath the overwhelming love she felt for the child, that what she was doing could not survive her daughter's knowledge of it. She understood that Tanya would see the danger immediately and would not be moved by the love that had produced it. She understood that Kate would be even more direct. She understood that even Irina, the most sympathetic of the three, the most naturally inclined to protect what was fragile, would recognize the impossibility of what Sasha had created and would not be willing to share the risk. And she wanted Vasily too much to risk being stopped. He was extraordinary in the way that all immortal children were extraordinary, which was to say that his extraordinariness was not the kind that could be assessed and appreciated from a comfortable distance, but the kind that bypassed ordinary aesthetic judgment entirely and went directly to something older and more primitive, something that lived below the level of conscious response. The transformation of a young child produced a creature of genuinely unearthly beauty, the features preserved at the precise moment of peak human vulnerability and openness, the particular quality of childhood innocence and trust fixed permanently in marble perfection and overlaid with the preternatural stillness of the vampire condition. Looking at an immortal child produced in every vampire who encountered one, an almost involuntary surge of protectiveness, so powerful it functioned less like an emotion and more like a reflex, like the flinch away from a flame or the reach towards something falling. They were, in some terrible and entirely accidental sense, designed to be loved. The same qualities that made them irresistible were precisely the qualities that made them catastrophic. And this was the particular cruelty at the heart of the immortal child problem. The beings most likely to inspire protection were the beings whose existence made protection impossible. Vasily could not learn restraint. This was not a failure of effort or intelligence in any conventional sense. The transformation had locked him at the developmental stage of the child he had been at the moment of his making, and that child's mind, however extraordinary its new capabilities in terms of raw sensory perception and physical power, and the accelerated processing that the vampire condition produced, had not been a mind capable of the kind of abstract reasoning that restraint required. Restraint required the ability to hold two things in mind simultaneously: the immediate desire and the longer-term consequence, and to choose the consequence over the desire again and again, building the choosing into something like habit through endless repetition and correction. There was no such process available to Vasily. There was only the thirst and the immediate response to it, unmediated by anything as sophisticated as foresight or the weighing of outcomes. He existed entirely in the present moment, which was in certain respects the purest kind of existence imaginable, and in practical terms an existence that could not be sustained near human populations without catastrophic results. He fed openly. He was visible. He was seen by humans who survived the encounter, humans who carried the knowledge of what they had witnessed into the wider world, into conversations and stories, and the slow accumulation of report that eventually found its way through the extensive and largely invisible network that the Volturi maintained, to the attention of the people in Volterra who made it their specific business to know about such things. The law against the creation of immortal children was the oldest and most absolute of all the Volturi's prohibitions. It had existed since before most of the other laws had been formalized. before the elaborate protocols around human knowledge and territorial boundaries and the management of exposure incidents had been assembled into the framework that governed vampire society in the modern era. It existed because immortal children had nearly destroyed everything once, in an era so distant that it survived only in the memories of the oldest living vampires. A period of catastrophic and widespread human awareness of vampire existence that had produced organized responses of a scale and ferocity that had brought their entire kind to the edge of annihilation. The Volturi had ended that crisis at enormous cost, and they had written its lesson into law with the permanence and the inflexibility of something that could never be allowed to become a question again. There were no exceptions. There was no appeals process, no mechanism for the consideration of individual circumstances, no possibility that a particular immortal child might be so exceptional or so carefully managed as to warrant a different response. The law existed precisely because the history of individual judgment in this area had already produced its evidence, and the evidence was definitive. They came north in numbers that left no ambiguity about their intention. The sisters were not in the territory when it happened. They had been hunting, ranging far enough from the home ground that they were genuinely absent and genuinely unaware, moving through ranges distant enough that even their extraordinary senses carried no signal of what was occurring behind them. Whether Sasha had arranged this absence deliberately, had perhaps suggested the hunting range, or created some other reason for her daughters to be far away when she understood that discovery was becoming inevitable, was something the sisters never determined with certainty. It was possible. It was entirely consistent with her character, with the particular quality of her love, that even at the end, she would have been thinking about protecting them. It was also possible that it was simply fortune, the blind and indifferent kind, operating in their favor for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone's intention. The Volturi did not negotiate. In circumstances involving immortal children, there was nothing to negotiate, because negotiation implied the existence of a different possible outcome, and the law admitted of no different possible outcome. They destroyed Vasily first, the child whose existence had triggered the response, whose uncontrolled and unconcealed feeding had set in motion the chain of events that ended here, was gone in the way that vampires were gone when the Volturi decided they should be, completely and without remainder. And then they destroyed Sasha, who had created him, and by creating him had committed the single violation for which the law prescribed only one answer. The execution was swift and final. The Volturi, whatever could be said about the nature of their authority and the selective cruelty of their enforcement, did not extend suffering beyond what the situation required. There was a kind of terrible efficiency to it that was almost its own form of mercy, though the word mercy sat poorly alongside any description of what happened that night. The sisters returned to find absence where presence had been. The specific quality of that discovery, arriving home to find not bodies, because vampire destruction leaves nothing so legible as a human body, but the evidence of what had occurred in more subtle and more devastating registers, the wrongness of a familiar space from which something essential had been removed, the particular smell of destruction that lingered in the cold air, the absolute silence where there should have been presence. This was not something any of them had language for, then or later. Tanya understood it first, her perception assembling the available evidence into its conclusion, with the speed that had always characterized her thinking. Kate understood it moments later, the understanding arriving as something physical before it became cognitive. Irina was last, and her understanding did not arrive as a thought at all, but as something that moved through her entire body, a response so total that it preceded and outlasted any specific comprehension of what it meant. The Volturi had left someone behind, as protocol required, to deliver the formal explanation to those who had not witnessed the execution. The messenger was precise and brief and entirely impersonal, delivering the facts with the neutral efficiency of someone discharging an administrative function, rather than informing 3 daughters that their mother had been destroyed. The substance of what was delivered was this: Sasha had violated the oldest law. The violation had been confirmed and the sentence carried out. The sisters' absence had been noted, and their ignorance of the child's existence had been verified. They were not implicated. They were not to be punished. They were simply required to understand what had happened and why, and to carry that understanding forward in whatever immortal existence remained to them. What followed was a grief unlike anything the sisters had previously known how to contain. They had lost humans they loved across the centuries, had accumulated that particular form of sorrow that was native to their condition, the grief of outliving everyone. But Sasha was not someone they had outlived. Sasha had been taken. She was the origin of what they were, the source of every immortal year they had lived, the person whose hands had brought them into this existence and whose voice had first explained to them what that existence meant and how to survive it. Her absence did not register as loss in the ordinary sense. It registered as something structural, a failure in the foundation beneath everything else. The discovery that what had seemed like solid ground was not solid at all. The guilt arrived alongside the grief and proved, in many ways, harder to manage. They had not known about Vasily. The Volturi had confirmed their ignorance. But the question of whether they should have known, whether centuries of closeness with Sasha should have made a secret of that magnitude impossible to maintain, whether they had missed something they ought to have seen. This question had no clean answer and did not soften with time. It simply became familiar, worn into the texture of daily existence like a stone worn smooth by the same water passing over it year after year. Present always. Painful in the old way that old injuries are painful, reliably and without surprise. What the grief eventually produced, after the long first season of simply existing inside it without being able to see past it, was clarity. It burned away everything tentative and left behind something harder and more certain and more deliberately chosen. The vegetarian commitment, which had been nascent and experimental among the sisters before Sasha's death, became after it something absolute and structural, a foundation rather than a preference. It was partly that they would honor Sasha's love by becoming something worthy of it. It was partly that they had seen the Volturi's justice applied and had no desire to give it cause to turn in their direction. But it was also something more personal than either of those reasons, something that had to do with survival and what it asks of the people who find themselves, through no particular virtue of their own, still present when others are not. They had been spared because they were innocent. That innocence had been a gift they had not earned and could not have arranged. And the only way to honor an unearned gift, the only way to make the having of it mean something, was to be worthy of it in every subsequent choice, to build a life that justified the surviving. They moved north. The territory they had shared with Sasha held her absence in every familiar corner and every known view, too loudly and too persistently for extended habitation to be anything other than a form of prolonged torment. The north offered what they needed most: distance and silence, and a landscape so vast and so indifferent that even the largest grief eventually found room to exist within it, without filling everything. They carried her with them regardless, as the dead are always carried by the living who love them, present in the small moments and the large ones, in the particular way the winter light sometimes fell and called up a memory so specific it was almost like presence. Sasha had made them, and in losing her, they had made themselves. That was the beginning of the Denali Coven, as it would come to be known across the centuries. Not a story of what had been built, but of what had been survived, and what had been chosen in the long, quiet aftermath of surviving. Of the three sisters, Tanya was the one who wanted most. This was not a flaw, though she had spent considerable portions of her long existence treating it as one, examining the wanting with the critical attention of someone who believes that desire itself is a form of weakness, that needing things from the world is a vulnerability that an immortal ought eventually to outgrow. She never did outgrow it. The wanting persisted across centuries with the same quiet insistence as the thirst, present in every season and every decade and every iteration of the life she was building, reshaping itself around circumstances but never disappearing entirely, never becoming small enough to ignore even in the periods when she was most deliberately focused on everything else. Eventually, after enough centuries had passed to grant a certain perspective on the matter that shorter lifespans simply could not provide, she stopped trying to outgrow it and started simply living alongside it, the way one learns to live alongside any permanent condition that cannot be cured and is not severe enough to be fatal. What she wanted, at its most essential and most honest, was what most beings want regardless of what they are or what world they inhabit. She wanted to be known, not observed. Vampires were observed constantly, catalogued and assessed, and regarded with a particular intense attention that extraordinary beauty inevitably attracted from every human who encountered it. That helpless, arrested quality people got when confronted with something their eyes could not move away from easily. Not feared, though fear was a common enough response to what she was when humans understood it clearly enough to be afraid. She wanted the specific and irreplaceable thing that genuine knowledge of another person provides. The sense that someone sees you accurately, without the distortions of projection or wishful thinking, or the simplified version of you that is easier to love than the real one. The sense that someone finds the true version of you, the one beneath the careful performance, beneath the management and the concealment, and decides that version is worth staying for. Not the beautiful surface, not the carefully assembled presentation, the actual interior person with all its complexity and contradiction. She had been looking for this across a very long time. Tanya's relationship with human men was old and complicated, and not easily reduced to the mythology that had grown up around it across the centuries. The succubus legends existed in large part because of her and her sisters, had grown from the observable fact of their extraordinary beauty and their tendency, across certain periods of their long existence to take human lovers, and had been elaborated by the human imagination into something considerably more dramatic and considerably less accurate than the reality. She had not drained her lovers. She had not lured men to destruction through supernatural compulsion or deliberate predation. She had, across the centuries, loved a series of human men with genuine feeling and genuine care and genuine attention, had been as fully present in those relationships as the fundamental impossibility of her situation allowed, and had lost every one of them to the ordinary passage of time that she was entirely exempt from, and they were absolutely not. The first she remembered most clearly, which was perhaps inevitable. First losses tend to leave the deepest impressions, arriving before the heart has developed the particular calluses that repeated grief eventually produces, before the person doing the losing has assembled any framework for understanding what is happening or any practiced knowledge of how to survive it. He had been a traveller, moving through the territories of the far north, on the kind of extended trading expedition that occasionally brought humans into the Denali wilderness in those early centuries of the Coven settlement there, following routes that connected distant communities across vast and largely uninhabited landscape. He was not remarkable by any external measure that a casual observer would have identified. He was not the most handsome man she had encountered in her centuries of moving through the world, not the most accomplished or the most powerful or the most anything that could be pointed to and named as obviously exceptional. What he was genuinely curious. He asked questions about the world with an appetite that was not performed and not strategic, but simply the natural expression of a mind that found nearly everything interesting and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He asked about the landscape and the animals and the people who had lived in this territory before him, about how things worked and why they were the way they were, about Tanya herself with a directness that was not invasive but simply honest, the directness of someone who wanted to know things and saw no advantage in approaching the wanting indirectly. And he listened to the answers with a quality of attention that is genuinely rarer than most people understand. The kind of listening that actually changes the listener, that integrates what it receives rather than simply storing it, that leaves the person being listened to feeling that what they said mattered and was heard rather than merely registered. Tanya had spent decades developing the ability to read humans with considerable accuracy from observation alone. From the 1,000 small signals that people emit continuously and involuntarily, the micro-expressions and the postural shifts, and the quality of attention they give to different things. What she read in this man was someone genuinely present in his own life, not performing presence while actually occupied somewhere else internally, not managing the impression he was making while pretending to be open. Simply there, in the conversation, in the landscape, in the moment he was actually occupying. She found this so unusual and so valuable that she loved him before she had decided to, which was both the best and the most dangerous way to love anyone, because love that arrives before the decision to allow it is much harder to contain than love that is considered and chosen and undertaken with appropriate caution. She was careful with him. This was always the first and most consuming challenge of loving a human. The management of what she was in proximity to someone who could not safely know what she was. She could not tell him the truth, not the full truth, not the truth that would have required him to restructure his entire understanding of what the world contained and what his companion actually was. She offered him instead the version of herself that was compatible with his continued safety and his continued ability to function in the world he actually inhabited. A woman who was unusual in certain ways, who was perhaps unsettling in certain unnameable registers, but who was not impossible. She managed the temperature of her skin through careful timing of physical contact. She ate minimally and explained it in ways that satisfied without inviting scrutiny. She was present enough to be real and absent enough to remain possible. He grew old. This was simply what happened, and she had known it would happen from the beginning of loving him, had carried the knowledge of it throughout the entire relationship, the way one carries the knowledge of an appointment that is still far away, but is always getting closer. She watched the years accumulate in him across what felt from her side like almost no time at all. Watched the particular beauty of a human life moving through its full arc. The gradual settling of his features, the silver that entered his hair slowly and then quickly. The way he moved through the world with increasing deliberateness and decreasing urgency, as though age had taught him that most things were worth taking time with. She had expected the grief to begin with the first visible signs of aging, to feel the loss starting before it arrived. Instead, she found something she had not anticipated, that each year added something to him that she valued more than what the previous year had held, that the older version of him was, in the way she most cared about, more fully himself than the younger version had been, as though the years stripped away everything that had been provisional and left behind only what was genuinely, permanently there. When he died, she carried him forward in the way she had by then learned to carry everyone she had loved and lost, which was not as an absence, but as a presence of a different kind, located not in the external world, but in the interior one, present in certain qualities of light and certain kinds of attention, and certain moments when something happened that she knew he would have found exactly as interesting as she found it. There were others across the centuries. Each was different in the particulars and recognizably similar in the essential shape. Genuine connection formed carefully. The long, sustained effort of managing what she was alongside what she felt. The slow approach of an ending she could see from much further away than the person approaching it with her, and then the long aftermath of integration. She became, across this accumulating education in human love and human loss, extraordinarily skilled at the early stages of connection, at seeing people clearly and quickly, at identifying what was genuinely valuable in them beneath the surface presentation, at creating the conditions in which they felt genuinely seen and genuinely met. What she could never master was the later stage, the part where connection deepened into something that required a shared future, because the futures she could offer were always the wrong shape for the people she was offering them to. She thought about transformation across many of those relationships, not as a plan, but as a presence in her thinking, a door that she was always aware of and never opened. The logic was clear enough. If the fundamental problem was the asymmetry between her immortality and her lover's mortality, the transformation was the available mechanism for resolving that asymmetry. She understood how it worked. She had the capability. The choice was there in every relationship, present and unspoken. and she was always aware of it. But transformation was not a solution to loneliness. She understood this with increasing clarity as the centuries passed. To transform someone was to impose 3 days of burning agony on them, to end their human life and replace it with this one, to take from them every future that their humanity had made available. Children, old age, the particular texture of a mortal life lived in full awareness of its finitude. To do this to someone she loved without absolute certainty that they would choose it freely and with complete understanding was something she could not make herself do regardless of what it would have given her in return. So she let them go, each one, and carried them forward, and kept building the life she was building in the north with her sisters, and remained, underneath all of it, someone who wanted more than the life she had and was not willing to obtain it by means she could not justify. Edward Cullen occupied a different category entirely and had from the beginning of their acquaintance. He was not a mortal man living a mortal life. He was already what she was, immortal, old, someone who understood the particular texture of this existence from the inside rather than observing it from the outside. There was no asymmetry to manage with him, no ending approaching from the distance, no performance of humanity required. She did not have to be careful with him in the ways she had always been careful with humans. She could simply exist in his company as what she actually was, and he would understand it because he was navigating the same condition from his own position within it. This was not a small thing. After centuries of careful management and deliberate concealment, the simple possibility of being unguarded was enormously appealing. She was drawn to him for reasons she understood clearly, and that she nonetheless could not argue herself out of across the decades of the two families' sustained friendship. He was genuinely good in a way she found rare and specifically valuable. Someone who had encountered the worst of what their shared nature could produce, had lived inside it, had acted from it, had understood from the inside what it meant to give the monster full authority, and had chosen repeatedly and at significant personal cost to be something different. He carried the weight of his choices with a seriousness that she respected enormously. He did not minimize what he had done or construct elaborate justifications for the years he had spent as something he no longer wished to be. He simply acknowledged it and continued choosing differently, which was the only form of redemption available to anyone and the form that required the most sustained effort. He was melancholy in a way she recognized and felt a specific tenderness toward. The particular melancholy of someone who wants more from existence than existence seems prepared to provide, who feels the gap between what is and what might be with unusual clarity and lives in that gap with unusual honesty. She understood that melancholy from the inside. She lived in a version of it herself, and there was something in the recognition of it in him that felt like the closest thing to being known that she had found in a very long time. He knew how she felt. This was the particular and inescapable difficulty of loving someone whose gift was the involuntary reception of others' thoughts. There was no privacy available to her feeling, no possibility of the dignified concealment that might have allowed her to hold it quietly, without it ever becoming something that required acknowledgement or response. He heard it in the ordinary course of being near her, heard it the way he heard everything in everyone's mind, without having sought it and without being able to prevent it, and he responded to it across the decades with a consistency that was never unkind and never dismissive, and never gave her any real foothold for the particular irrational hope that the situation might eventually change. The hope that persists in the absence of active discouragement, even when active discouragement is not the only evidence available. He was simply, clearly, genuinely unavailable to her in the way she wanted him. Not because of a choice he was making against her specifically, but because of the simple truth of what existed and what did not exist in him when he looked at her. She learned to hold this without letting it diminish the genuine warmth of the friendship that existed between them, which was real and valuable in its own right and deserved better than to be treated as a consolation prize for something else. She learned to be glad of what there was between them, rather than persistently mourning what there was not. This took longer than she would have preferred, and required more deliberate effort than she was entirely comfortable acknowledging. But she managed it, and the managing of it felt, eventually, like its own form of the thing she had always most wanted to be. Someone who saw clearly and chose well. When Bella Swan arrived in Edward's life, Tanya understood what had happened before she had met the girl or been given any formal account of the situation. She heard it in the quality of everything the Cullen family communicated when her name was mentioned, in the particular reorganization that had occurred in a family she knew well enough to read in its collective expressions, and she heard it most clearly in Edward himself, in the quality of how he spoke about this human girl, which carried something she had never heard in him across decades of acquaintance. A fullness, an orientation, a quality of being completely present in a direction that was not going to change. She set down the hope she had been carrying, not in a single dramatic moment, but across a period of private reckoning, gradually and then completely, with the same quality of deliberate choice that had characterized her best decisions across the long span of her existence. She set it down and examined what remained when it was gone, and found that what remained was substantial. Genuine affection for Edward, genuine curiosity about the girl who'd reached him in the ways Tanya had not, genuine investment in the well-being of a family she had chosen to be close to across many decades. When she met Bella, she looked at her with the clear and practiced attention she brought to everyone she genuinely tried to understand. And what she found beneath the ordinary human surface, and the slightly bewildering courage and the quality of stillness that seemed unusual for someone so young, was someone worth finding. Someone who had looked at the full truth of what Edward was and had not flinched from it, had not constructed a comfortable, simplified version of it to love instead of the real thing. Someone who saw clearly and stayed anyway. Tanya understood, with a completeness that surprised her, why that particular quality would have reached Edward in the ways that nothing else had. She remained in the north. She continued to hunt across the vast tundra and watch the aurora through the winter darkness and be, in all the ways available to her, genuinely present in the life she had built across the centuries in the shadow of the great mountain. The loneliness was still there, as it had always been, as she had come to understand. It would probably always be some part of what she was and how she moved through the world. But loneliness and a full life had never been mutually exclusive. She had proven that across centuries of evidence, across every human she had loved and every loss she had survived, and every morning she had watched come up over the Alaskan wilderness and found still something in it worth the attention that had always been enough to build on. It remained enough now, and she suspected, with the particular wisdom of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time, that it would remain enough for whatever centuries came after this one. Kate had always known exactly what she was. This was not as common among their kind as one might expect. Many vampires spent considerable portions of their immortal existence in negotiation with the truth of what they had become, constructing frameworks of justification or denial or selective emphasis that allowed them to inhabit their nature without confronting it too directly. Tanya managed her nature through longing, through the persistent orientation towards something more human than what she was. Irina managed hers through feeling, through the depth of her emotional responses that kept her tethered to something warmer than the cold facts of their existence. Even Carlyle, whom Kate respected enormously, managed his nature through the sustained philosophical project of being better than it, through the constant deliberate effort of choosing differently. Kate simply knew what she was and proceeded from that knowledge, without excessive drama in either direction. She was a vampire. She was predatory by design and immortal by accident, and dangerous in ways that most of the world had no framework for understanding. She had chosen, for reasons she considered sound, and continued to consider sound across centuries of testing, to live by a different set of rules than her nature strictly required. But she did not confuse the choice with the transformation of the underlying nature. The predator was still there. The thirst was still there. She had simply decided, with the directness that characterized all her significant decisions, that the predator would be governed rather than indulged, and she had maintained that governance with the consistent efficiency she brought to everything she undertook. Her gift had arrived with the transformation, as gifts did, emerging from whatever intersection of human potential and vampire change produced these additions to the basic template. It manifested first as an accident in the early weeks after she woke into her new existence, when Sasha touched her arm in guidance and recoiled with an involuntary sound of pain. Kate had not understood immediately what had happened. She had looked at her own arm with the particular attention of someone trying to read an unfamiliar text, turning it in the candlelight, finding nothing externally different about the pale marble surface of her new skin. Sasha had explained it carefully, with the patience she brought to all her daughter's discoveries, and Kate had listened and then spent the following weeks learning the precise parameters of what she carried. The gift was an electric current that lived in her skin, present at all times at a low and manageable level, capable of being amplified at will into something that ranged from discomfort to genuine incapacitation, depending on how much she chose to project and for how long. She could direct it or diffuse it, concentrate it in her hands for precise application, or allow it to radiate from her entire surface as a general deterrent. She could modulate the intensity with a control that improved across the decades, as she learned the gift of the way one learns any complex instrument, through practice and failure, and the gradual development of a fluency that eventually stopped requiring conscious attention and became simply part of how she moved through the world. The practical applications were obvious, and she did not pretend otherwise. The gift made her formidable in a way that went beyond the standard formidability of any vampire. Most vampires in a physical confrontation relied on strength and speed, and the marble durability of their bodies, advantages that were significant but have functioned on relatively even terms when the opponents shared the same basic physical nature. Kate's gift introduced an asymmetry that had nothing to do with size or age or physical power. She could incapacitate opponents who were larger and older and technically stronger, could end confrontations before they became genuinely dangerous, could protect herself and her sisters with an efficiency that did not require her to be the biggest or the fastest presence in any given situation. She used it sparingly and deliberately. This was partly strategic. A gift that was deployed constantly and indiscriminately became predictable, and predictability was his own vulnerability, and partly something more personal. Kate had no interest in violence for its own sake. She had no appetite for dominance or the performance of power. She used the gift when she needed it, and returned it to its resting state when she did not. And she tried not to think too carefully about the fact that what she carried in her skin was, at its most fundamental level, a weapon. Because thinking about it in those terms led to a kind of self-scrutiny that she found less productive than simply managing it well. The Volturi knew about her gift. Of course they did. The Volturi made it their specific and sustained business to know about every significant gift that existed anywhere in the vampire world, maintaining their catalogue of abilities with the thoroughness of collectors who understood that what they catalogued was also what they controlled. Aro's interest in Kate had been expressed across multiple encounters spanning centuries, always in the same register: appreciative, covetous, entirely accustomed to eventually obtaining what he wanted, and therefore patient in a way that people who expected to wait a long time could afford to be. He had never asked her directly, which he understood as its own form of strategy. Direct requests could be directly refused, and a direct refusal created a position that was awkward to retreat from gracefully. Instead, he communicated his interest through the quality of his attention, through the particular warmth he extended to her in encounters that had other official purposes, through the way he found reasons to include her in conversations that went slightly beyond what the immediate business required. She received all of it clearly, understood its intent precisely, and declined it just as consistently, without ever needing to make the refusal explicit enough to become a confrontation. She had no interest in Volterra. This was not a complicated position, and it did not require extensive justification. She had built a life in the north with her sisters, a life that was hers in the ways that mattered, chosen rather than assigned, maintained by ongoing decision rather than obligation, oriented around values she had arrived at through her own reasoning rather than inherited from an institution. The Volturi Guard was many things, some of them genuinely impressive, but it was not a place where what she had built would survive. It was a place where she would become a function of someone else's project, where her gift would be an asset belonging to an organization rather than a quality belonging to her. She had no interest in that trade regardless of what it offered in return. The centuries passed with the particular quality of centuries that are genuinely inhabited rather than merely endured. Kate hunted and fought and read and thought and maintained the Coven's physical territory with the steady attentiveness of someone who took seriously the responsibility of the life she had chosen. She was not lonely in the way Tanya was lonely. Solitude had never frightened her, and had often felt actively preferable to the noise and complication of extensive social engagement. She had her sisters, whose company she valued deeply without requiring it constantly. She had the land itself, which offered more than most people understood if you paid attention to it with sufficient patience. She had the particular satisfaction of being exactly as competent as she needed to be at everything she undertook, which was not a small thing, and was not as common as the people who had it tended to assume. She had decided somewhere across the middle centuries of her existence that she did not need a mate. This decision was not made in the dramatic manner of a renunciation, not announced or committed to, with a kind of emphasis that would have made it feel like it mattered too much. It was simply a conclusion she had arrived at through the available evidence and had stopped revisiting, the way one stops revisiting questions that have been adequately answered. She was sufficient to herself. The coven provided the connection that connection required. What romantic partnership would add to that equation was not obvious to her, and the complications it would introduce were considerably more obvious than the benefits. Then Garrett arrived, and the conclusions she had stopped revisiting turned out to be less settled than she had believed. He was a nomad of the American Revolutionary War era, transformed somewhere in the chaos of that conflict in the late 1700s, and he carried that origin in the quality of his thinking, the way all vampires carried their transformation era. Not as a costume, but as a genuine orientation, a set of assumptions about the world that had been formed in a specific historical moment, and had become foundational enough to survive everything that came after. He believed in individual liberty with the specificity of someone who had formed that belief when it was genuinely radical, when it cost something to hold it and more to act on it. He was suspicious of concentrated authority in the instinctive way of someone who had seen what concentrated authority did when it was not checked, and his suspicion of the Volturi was accordingly deep and not entirely separable from his broader political philosophy. He was also, Kate noted, with the precise observational attention she brought to everything, completely without pretension. He said what he meant. He did not manage the impression he was making, did not perform a version of himself calibrated to what he thought the audience wanted to see. What he thought was what he said, and what he said was what he meant, and the gap between his interior state and his exterior presentation that most people maintained as a matter of social habit simply did not seem to exist in him in any significant way. Kate found this quality so unusual that she was initially suspicious of it, turning it over in her careful analytical attention, looking for the seam where the performance began. She did not find one. He came to Denali in connection with the gathering that assembled around the Cullens and Renesmee, drawn by the request for witnesses and by the particular quality of a situation that engaged his sense of justice and his instinctive opposition to the kind of institutional overreach that the Volturi's handling of the situation represented. He had no prior relationship with the Cullen family and no particular investment in the outcome beyond what his own sense of right and wrong demanded of him. This was, Kate recognized, a form of courage that was different from the courage of fighting for something you already loved. It was the harder kind, the courage of standing for something because it was correct rather than because you had a personal stake in it. She did not decide to care about him. That was the most accurate account of what happened. And Kate, who valued accuracy in all things, held to it, even when the more romantic version of the story might have been easier to offer. She did not decide. She simply found, across the days of the gathering, that she was paying attention to where he was with the same quality of automatic awareness that she paid to threats and to her sisters, and that his absence from a room registered in a way that other people's absences did not, and that the conversations they had were the ones she found herself returning to afterward with the particular interest of someone who found that being listened to by this specific person felt different from being listened to by anyone else. She tested him with the gift, because that was what she did when she needed to understand something clearly, not maliciously and not without warning. She was direct with him in the way she was direct with everything, told him what the gift did and what she was going to do, and gave him the opportunity to decline. He did not decline. He held out his hand with the steadiness of someone who had decided that whatever was on the other side of the experience was worth knowing. And when the current moved through him and he registered the pain with nothing more than a sharp breath and a slight tightening around the eyes, he looked at her afterward with an expression that was not resentment and not performance, but simply honest acknowledgement of what had just happened. He asked her to do it again, not because he enjoyed pain, but because he wanted to understand it, wanted to know its parameters, wanted to be able to say he had genuinely encountered what she was, rather than the managed version of it. She found this so unexpectedly reasonable that she was briefly without a response, which was an experience she had not had in a very long time. He stayed after the gathering resolved. This was not a foregone conclusion. Nomads stayed and left according to their own rhythms and their own reasons, and Kate had not allowed herself to assume that the outcome of the Volturi confrontation would determine anything about what happened between them. But he stayed, and when she asked him why, he told her the truth in the direct way he told everything, because he wanted to, and because he had found something in Denali worth staying for, and because he was old enough to know that things worth staying for were rare enough that leaving them out of a misplaced commitment to prior patterns was a form of foolishness he had no interest in. She did not become a different person when she chose him. This was important to her, and she was clear about it from the beginning. In the direct way, she was clear about everything that mattered. She was still who she had always been, the same clear-eyed, self-sufficient, slightly formidable vampire who'd been managing her own existence with complete adequacy for centuries and intended to continue doing so. What she added was not a replacement for that self-sufficiency, but something that existed alongside it, something that occupied the space she had decided was unnecessary and turned out to have been waiting for something specific. Kate and Garrett were not a romantic story in the conventional sense of the term. They were two old and independent and thoroughly self-determined beings who had found, somewhat to the surprise of at least one of them, that the world was more interesting in the other's company than without it. They argued with genuine engagement and agreed with genuine pleasure, and moved through the Denali wilderness and through the wider world with the ease of two people who had each found in the other someone who did not require managing. she still carried the gift in her skin, that constant low current that had been part of her longer than anything, except the thirst. It was still a weapon when it needed to be, and a boundary when it needed to be that, and it was still hers entirely, belonging to her before it belonged to any relationship or any coven or any story that could be told about her from the outside. But now there was someone who had held out his hand and asked to understand it, and had not flinched, and had stayed. That was not nothing. After centuries of knowing exactly what she was, Kate had discovered that being known by someone else was its own kind of gift, quieter than the one she carried in her skin, and considerably harder to come by. Of the three sisters, Irina felt everything the most. This had always been true, from the earliest years of their shared existence, long before any of the specific griefs that would eventually define her arc had arrived to confirm it. She felt joy more completely than her sisters and recovered from difficulty more slowly, and loved with a totality that left very little of herself in reserve. Tanya had her longing, which was real and sustained, but which she managed with the deliberate philosophical apparatus she brought to most things. Kate had her clarity, which functioned as a kind of emotional regulation, a way of seeing that kept feeling from overwhelming function. Irina had neither of these buffers. What she had was depth, which was both the best and the most dangerous thing a person could have when the world was as capable of loss as the world consistently proved to be. She had survived Sasha's death. She had survived it in the technical sense that she was still present afterward, still moving through the world, still hunting and existing and being present in the Coven's daily life. But survival and recovery are not the same thing, and Irina had understood this distinction from the inside in ways that her sisters, who were more naturally resilient, could observe but not entirely share. She carried Sasha differently than Tanya, and Kate carried her, not as a settled grief that had found its place in the architecture of daily existence, but as something that remained raw at its edges for a very long time, something that could be reopened by the wrong combination of circumstances with a speed that surprised even her. This was the particular vulnerability that Laurent found, though found was not quite the right word, because it implied a search that had not been part of his intention when he arrived in Denali. Laurent was not, at the time of his arrival, someone who inspired confidence. His history was not the history of someone who had been trying very hard to be better than his nature, and he did not present himself as something other than what he was, which was a nomadic vampire who had been traveling in very poor company for some time, and had arrived at a point where continuing in that direction was no longer something he was willing to do. He had been part of the coven that included James, the tracker whose obsession with Bella Swan had ended in his own destruction in a ballet studio in Phoenix. He had been present at the baseball clearing, had watched James's hunting instincts lock onto a human girl with the focused inevitability of a compass finding north, and had understood in that moment that the direction James was committed to going was one Laurent had no interest in following. He had separated from Victoria before the final confrontation, moved by a pragmatic assessment of the situation rather than any particular moral awakening. He was honest about this when he arrived in Denali. He did not claim to have left out of principle. He said he had left because the odds were poor and the cause was not his, and he had seen enough to understand that pursuing Bella Swan through 7 protective vampires was an enterprise with a predictable and unpleasant conclusion. This honesty, which was less flattering than the alternative narrative he could easily have constructed, was the first thing about him that gave Irina pause. She was cautious with him initially, which was the appropriate response to a nomad of his history arriving at their door. The Coven's hospitality was genuine but not unconditional, extended with the awareness that welcoming someone in required some reasonable assessment of whether that someone was safe to welcome. Laurent submitted to this assessment with a patience that was itself informative. The patience of someone who understood that he had not earned trust and was willing to wait for the process by which trust was established rather than expecting it to be granted on request. He stayed, not immediately as a permanent member of the household, but as a prolonged presence, someone who was there enough to become known and not so intrusive as to overwhelm the existing dynamic. He tried the vegetarian diet with an honesty about its difficulty that Irina respected. He did not pretend it was easy, or that the adjustment was faster than it was. He struggled with it openly and continued trying, which was, she had come to understand from her own experience with the commitment, considerably more meaningful than succeeding would have been. Success without struggle was just luck. Continued effort despite difficulty was a thing that actually meant something. She began to love him across the ordinary texture of shared daily existence, which is the only way love that lasts actually develops. Not in a single significant moment, but across the accumulation of small ones. The particular way he described things he had seen in his centuries of nomadic travel, the dry humor that emerged once he was comfortable enough to let it, the quality of attention he gave her when she spoke that was similar to the quality she most valued in herself when she was paying attention to something she genuinely cared about. He saw her clearly. The sensitivity that her sisters sometimes treated with careful management, the depth of feeling that could be overwhelming to people who were not prepared for it, and did not treat it as something to be navigated around, but simply as part of who she was. She believed he could become something different from what he had been. This was not naivety. She had seen enough of the world and of their kind to understand that genuine change was rare, and that the people most likely to claim it were often the least likely to achieve it. But she had also seen Sasha, whose love for her daughters had made her capable of extraordinary things across the long span of their time together, and she understood that love was one of the few forces capable of producing genuine alteration in what seemed like fixed natures. She believed Laurent because she knew him by then, knew the specific texture of his character in the way that sustained proximity produces knowledge, and what she knew did not suggest performance. It suggested a man in the slow and effortful process of becoming something better than he had been. Laurent died in the Quileute Wolves' territory. The specific circumstances reached Irina in pieces through the fractured and incomplete channels that information traveled when it concerned events that no one had been watching with the intention of later reporting. What she assembled from those pieces was this. Laurent had gone to Forks. He had encountered Bella Swan, alone in a meadow. He had intended to kill her, carrying out a request from Victoria that he had agreed to before his time in Denali had fully changed the direction he was moving. The wolves had found him before he could act. They had killed him in the way that wolves of their nature could kill vampires, completely and without the possibility of reconstruction. She did not learn for a long time what he had been doing in Forks. She did not know about Victoria's request or about the specific intention he had brought to that meadow. She knew only that he had gone somewhere and had not come back, and that the Quilute wolves were responsible for his absence, and that the Cullen family had an alliance with those wolves and continued to maintain it after Laurent's death. The grief was total in the way that all of Irina's feelings were total. It did not arrive gradually or allow her the incremental adjustment that grief sometimes provides when it comes in stages, the initial shock giving way to something more manageable, the sharp edges dulling across time into something that could eventually be lived alongside. It arrived all at once and remained at full intensity for much longer than her sisters thought was healthy. For long enough that both Tanya and Kate found themselves exchanging the particular look that pass between people who love someone and are watching that person not find their way back from something. Tanya sat with her. Kate sat with her. They said the things that people say when they are sitting with someone who is grieving, the true things and the insufficient things and the things that are both simultaneously. Because grief does not respond well to language, and yet silence is also inadequate. And the people who love you keep trying anyway, because trying is all there is. Irina heard them and appreciated them, and did not find her way back. What she found instead was something that felt, from the inside, like clarity, but which was in fact something considerably more dangerous. The calcification of grief into a fixed and specific hatred. The Quilute wolves had killed Laurent. The Cullens protected and allied with the Quilute wolves. Therefore, the Cullens, by the logic of this calcified grief, bore a relationship to Laurent's death that made Irina's continued warmth toward them impossible to maintain. She knew this was not entirely rational. She knew that the connection she was drawing was not the clean, causal chain it felt like from the inside, that the Cullens had not killed Laurent, and had not sent the wolves to kill him, and had not made the choices that had placed him in their territory in the first place. She knew all of this in the abstract way that people know things they cannot feel, and the knowing made no practical difference to the shape of what she was experiencing. The fracture in the Denali Cullen relationship that followed was painful for everyone involved and resolved nothing. Irina's withdrawal from the warmth that had characterized decades of friendship between the two families was not dramatic or announced, but simply real. A cooling that the Cullens could feel and could not address, because the source of it was rooted in something that did not have a reasonable solution. They had not done wrong by her. They had simply continued to exist in an alliance that her grief had made intolerable to her, and there was nothing they could say that would change what Laurent's death had meant, or what it continued to mean in the years that followed. She was alone with it in the way that certain griefs are specifically isolating, producing a loneliness that is different from ordinary solitude, because it exists in the presence of people who love you and cannot reach you anyway. She went to Forks, not with a plan, not with a specific intention beyond the pull of proximity to the place where Laurent had died, the particular gravity that sites of loss exert on the people who are oriented around them. She moved through the edges of the territory with the careful invisibility of long practice, and it was in this state, moving quietly through familiar wilderness, not looking for anything specific, that she saw the child. She saw her from a distance, which was the cruelest possible circumstance, because distance provided exactly the wrong amount of information. Close enough to see a small figure in the company of vampires, too far to see the details that would have immediately communicated what the child actually was. What she saw was a young child among vampires. What her entire history, the deepest and most foundational wound in her existence, immediately told her she was seeing was an immortal child. The response was not considered. It could not have been considered. Arriving as it did from the intersection of genuine, incomplete information and decades of accumulated trauma around exactly this category of thing. She had watched Sasha die for the creation of an immortal child. She had understood in the immediate aftermath of that loss that immortal children were not things that could be reasoned with or managed or made safe by the love of the people who created them. She had lived for centuries with that understanding pressed into her like an impression in wax, present and legible in everything she did. She went to the Volturi. This was the thing she did. She delivered what she believed was accurate information about a genuine violation of the oldest and most important law. And she believed she was doing what was necessary, what was right. What Sasha's death had taught her was owed to the world in the form of vigilance. She was not acting out of malice. She was not, even in the complicated territory of her grief-altered state, trying to harm the Cullens for the wound she believed they bore in Laurent's death. She was acting from the part of herself that had been shaped by the most devastating loss of her existence into someone who took the immortal child law with an absolute and personal seriousness that went beyond ordinary rule following. She did not know she was wrong until she was standing in front of the assembled gathering, in front of the Volturi and the witnesses and the child herself, and the distance was gone. Renesmee Cullen was not an immortal child. The truth of this was immediately and completely visible at close range, in a way it had not been from the distance where Irina had made her assessment. The child was growing. The child was reasoning. The child had the specific quality of presence that belonged to something genuinely alive in the full sense. Something in the process of developing rather than something frozen at the moment of its making. Irina looked at her and understood with the completeness of certainty that she had been wrong. She said so. She recanted clearly and without hesitation, standing in front of the Volturi and every assembled witness and stating plainly that she had been mistaken, that the child was not what she had believed, that the accusation had been made in error. This was not a small thing to do. The Volturi did not respond warmly to having been mobilized on false information, and Irina understood, standing there delivering her recantation, that the ground beneath her was not stable. She said it anyway, because it was true, and because the truth was what was owed to the people she had wronged, regardless of what the saying of it cost her. The Volturi destroyed her for it, not for the original accusation, which they would likely have forgiven with the cold institutional pragmatism that governed their responses to information that proved incorrect. They destroyed her because her recantation, offered openly and in front of the assembled witnesses, represented a challenge to the authority they had brought to bear on the situation, a public demonstration that the enormous force they had mobilized had been deployed in error. That could not be allowed to stand without consequence, not in front of that many witnesses, not in the context of the broader demonstration of power that the Volturi had come to make. Tanya and Kate watched their sister die. They had no warning adequate to the reality of it. They had understood that Irina was in a precarious position, had felt the particular quality of danger that the gathering carried, but the specific moment arrived too quickly for the kind of preparation that might have made it possible to intervene or to not be standing exactly where they were standing when it happened. They saw it completely. They were present for every moment of it, and there was nothing they could do that would not have immediately and certainly ended in their own destruction and the destruction of everyone who had come to stand as witnesses. Kate's gift moved in her skin with an intensity it had never reached before. The electricity of it pressing against the inside of her surface with a force that was almost painful, demanding release and direction. Jasper's hands were on her. Edward's voice was in her ear. The people around her who understood what she was considering were holding her back, not with force, but with a particular desperate urgency of people who knew that acting on what she was feeling would end in her death and the deaths of others, and that Irina, who had loved her sisters with everything she had, would not have wanted that. Tanya did not move. She stood perfectly still with the stillness that was the most extreme expression of her nature. The stillness that meant not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a feeling so total that movement seemed impossible. She watched. She bore witness. She did the only thing that was available to do, which was to remain present for what was happening and to not look away. The gathering resolved. The Volturi withdrew. The witnesses dispersed across the days that followed, returning to their own lives and their own territories, carrying the memory of what they had seen. And the Denali sisters remained with the specific shape of this loss, which was different from every loss that had preceded it. They had lost Sasha to a choice Sasha had made, and the grief of it had been compounded by the question of whether they should have known. They had lost the human people they had loved across the centuries to time, which was impersonal and could not be held responsible. But they had lost Irina in full view, completely and without ambiguity, to a decision made by people who were still present in the world and who had made it with full awareness of what they were doing. What they did with that knowledge, how they carried it forward into the centuries that remained to them, was a question that did not have a simple answer. The grief was too large and too specific for simple answers. What they had was each other, which was what they had always had, and the North, which had held them through everything that had come before and would continue to hold them through this. Irina had felt everything the most. She had loved Laurent with her whole self and had lost him and had not found her way back. And the not finding her way back had led her by a path that was entirely comprehensible and entirely tragic to a morning in a clearing where the Volturi had come, and she had told the truth, and it had cost her everything. She had loved her sisters the same way she loved everything, completely and without reservation, holding nothing back against the possibility of loss. They carried her forward in the way she had always carried the people she loved, not as an absence, as a presence that had changed location, moving from the world they could all see into the one that only the people left behind could access, the interior world where the dead continue to live in the memories and the habits and the specific quality of love that outlasts its object and keeps moving through the world long after the person who inspired it is gone. There are people who find their way to the right life by knowing from the beginning what they want and moving toward it with intention, by having the clarity and the confidence and the self-knowledge required to identify the destination and navigate toward it without significant detour. And there are people who find the right life by moving away from the wrong one for long enough and far enough that something better becomes visible by contrast, becomes legible in a way it could not have been, without the accumulated evidence of everything that was not it. Eleazar belonged firmly and without apology to the second category, and he was honest enough with himself across the long span of his existence to acknowledge this without constructing a more flattering version of how he had arrived, where he had arrived. He had not found the Denali Coven through wisdom or foresight or the kind of principled clarity that made for a satisfying and admirable narrative. He had found it through centuries of accumulating discomfort with where he was, and through one person who made the contrast between where he was and where he might be impossible to continue managing by the ordinary mechanisms of compartmentalization and professional dedication that had sustained him for so long. That person was Carmen. But Carmen came later in the telling, as she had come later in the living, and to understand what she meant required understanding first what had preceded her, what Eleazar had been before she made everything that came before her impossible to continue. He had served the Volturi for a very long time. The precise duration was something he had stopped trying to calculate with confidence somewhere in the middle centuries of his service, belonging as it did to the category of things that blur across the span of sufficient years into a general sense of always, rather than the specific and manageable count. He had been with them long enough that the rhythms and routines of Volterra had ceased to feel like the rhythms and routines of a specific place, and had simply become the ambient condition of his existence, the background against which everything else occurred. The architecture of those ancient stone corridors, the particular quality of light that filtered through windows designed for concealment rather than illumination, the social dynamics of the guard and the hierarchy it maintained with the naturalness of something that had been in place long enough to seem inevitable. All of this had become so familiar as to be effectively invisible, the way one stops seeing the details of a room one has lived in for many years. The Volturi did not encourage their guard members to maintain strong connections to the world outside Volterra. Not through prohibition exactly, not through rules that could be pointed to and stated plainly, through the more effective and more durable mechanism of making Volterra itself so complete, so self-referential, so thoroughly the center of everything that mattered in the vampire world, that the outside gradually ceased to feel like somewhere one might actually go, and gradually became instead something more abstract, a territory one moved through on assignment and returned from with relief at being back within the known and managed world of the guard. Eleazar's gift had placed him in a specific and particularly valued position within this structure. He could sense gifts, not use them or interfere with them or interact with them in any of the more dramatic ways that other gifted vampires could interact with abilities. Not the broad reach of Aro's touch, not the offensive capability of Jane or Alec, nothing that operated as a weapon or a tool of direct control. He simply knew. In the presence of any vampire or any human being with latent potential, he perceived the gift as a quality in his awareness, a texture or a tone that registered with the involuntary immediacy of a musician perceiving pitch. something known before it was consciously processed, rather than something arrived at through deliberate analysis. He knew what someone carried before they demonstrated it. He could sense the shape of developing abilities that had not yet fully manifested, could perceive the outline of what something would become, even when it existed only as a trace of potential rather than an operational fact. Aro found this capability extraordinarily and specifically useful in ways that went beyond the ordinary contributions of even gifted guard members. The Volturi's long project of assembling the most powerful and most comprehensively gifted guard in the vampire world required, before anything else, knowing where the gifts were located across the vast and largely unsurveyed territory of the vampire population worldwide. It required someone who could move through the world, attend gatherings and visit territories, and make contact with individuals who had come to the Volturi's attention, and return with accurate assessments of what those individuals carried and what level of interest they warranted. Eliza was that instrument, refined across centuries of practice into something of considerable precision and reliability. He was efficient at the work, thorough. His assessments were accurate, and his methods were sufficiently unobtrusive that the vampires he assessed rarely understood fully what had occurred during an encounter with him. He possessed the social facility that the work required, the ability to move comfortably across many different contexts and personalities, to put people at ease, to conduct the actual business of assessment underneath the surface of an interaction that seemed to be about something else entirely. He had been, in every measurable professional sense, an excellent servant of the Volturi's interests across a span of time that most of the guard could not match. What he had also been, quietly and persistently, and with increasing difficulty across the later centuries of his service, was someone who noticed things he was not required to notice, and who couldn't stop noticing them, regardless of the practical inconvenience of doing so. He noticed what happened to the vampires he assessed, who carried gifts that Aro wanted, and who declined, whether politely or explicitly, to join the guard. He noticed the process by which such declinations were resolved, the particular machinery of consequence that the Volturi deployed against those who had what they wanted and would not give it willingly. He noticed the language used to describe these outcomes within the guard's internal discourse, the way necessity and law and the protection of their entire kind's continued secrecy were invoked to transform what was fundamentally the coercive acquisition of power into something that could be spoken of without discomfort. He noticed the difference between the Volturi's stated purpose, which was the maintenance of laws that genuinely served the vampire world's continued survival, and the Volturi's actual operation, which served those laws when they coincided with the Volturi's interests, and served other things when they did not coincide. He noticed all of this, and he continued to serve. And the gap between those two facts, the noticing and the continuing, grew across the decades into something that required active daily management to prevent from becoming the kind of internal contradiction that could not be sustained indefinitely. He managed it the way one manages chronic conditions that cannot be cured but can be lived with, through routine and discipline and the careful allocation of attention away from the aspects most likely to produce paralysis. He might have continued managing it indefinitely. This was the uncomfortable truth that he had eventually made peace with. He might never have found his way out through his own internal resources alone. The discomfort was real, but it was also familiar, and familiar discomfort has a particular gravity, that genuine change requires disrupting, and disruption of that kind generally requires something from outside the existing system to introduce the necessary force. Carmen was that force, though she would have been deeply amused by the description, and would have said so immediately and without tact. She was a nomad moving through the territories of southern Europe when Eliza first encountered her, living in the loose and unhurried way of vampires who have found that solitude suits them and have organized their existence around that finding without treating it as a deprivation. She had come to the Volturi's attention through the ordinary mechanisms of their intelligence network, flagged as someone whose existence warranted assessment. Eleazar was assigned the assessment with the same professional neutrality that characterized all his assignments, traveling to the region and making contact through the indirect approaches his methods favored. She greeted him as though she had been expecting him, which he later understood was not because she had specific foreknowledge of his arrival, but because she was the kind of person who met whatever arrived with sufficient equanimity that she rarely looked genuinely surprised. She was direct with him from the first moments of their acquaintance, direct in the specific way that is not the directness of social indifference or aggression, but the directness of someone who has thought carefully about honesty and concluded that it is simply more interesting than the alternatives, more productive and more respectful and more genuinely useful to everyone involved. She had no significant gift in the technical sense. This was the information his assessment was designed to confirm or deny, and he confirmed it accurately. What she carried was not a supernatural ability that transcended normal vampire capabilities, but a quality of character so fully developed and so consistently expressed that it occupied his awareness in the space where a gift might have been with equivalent presence an entirely different nature. She was warm with the particular warmth that survives the coldness of their physical condition entirely intact. Warmth that expressed itself not through sentimentality or the performance of feeling, but through the quality of genuine interest she brought to everything she encountered. She listened with the active quality of someone for whom listening was not a passive state of waiting to speak, but an actual engagement with what was being said and what it meant and what it suggested about the person saying it. She was curious about the world and about people, and about the long, strange arc of existence with an appetite that had clearly not been diminished by however many centuries she had been living it. Eleazar assessed her, delivered his report to Volterra. No significant gift, no particular priority, and returned to his work. Then he spent the following decades thinking about her with a consistency and an intensity that were not entirely comfortable and were entirely impossible to resolve by the ordinary means he used for resolving things, because the ordinary means all involved redirecting attention towards something else, and there was nothing else that reliably held his attention in the same way. He went back to find her. He constructed various professional justifications for this that he did not entirely believe himself, and she received him with the same unperturbed quality she had brought to their first encounter, and they talked for longer than any professional purpose required, and then longer still, and then he returned to Volterra and found that the contrast between where he had just been and where he'd returned to had shifted in quality from something he could manage to something he could not stop examining. They met several more times across the years that followed, in locations that moved gradually northward as Carmen's preferred route shifted, and as Elizar found reasons to be in territories that happened to overlap with hers. The conversations deepened in the way that conversations deepen when both people involved are paying genuine attention and are honest enough to move past the surface into the things that actually matter. Carmen talked about her existence with a clarity that was neither self-congratulatory nor self-critical, but simply accurate. She knew what she was. She knew what she had chosen. She knew what she valued and why. And she communicated all of it with the confidence of someone who had done the work of actually knowing themselves, rather than constructing a preferable version. She talked about freedom in terms that were not abstract political philosophy, but immediate and practical. The freedom of moving through the world without institutional obligation, without the requirement to use what she perceived in service of someone else's project, without the daily negotiation between what she saw and what she was required to do with it. She was not talking about Elizar's situation specifically. She was talking about her own life, her own values, the things that made her existence feel like hers, rather than like a function she was performing within someone else's larger structure. But she was talking to him, and he heard every word in the specific register of someone receiving information that is directly and uncomfortably applicable to his own circumstances. She did not ask him to leave Volterra. She was explicit about this. In the direct way, she was explicit about everything that mattered. She was not constructing a situation in which his continued service became incompatible with her continued presence in his life. She was not issuing an ultimatum or making herself into a conditional reward for the right choice. She was simply herself, consistently and without modification or strategic calibration. And the effect of that consistency over time was that the contrast between what she represented and what Volterra represented became something Elizar could no longer process as an abstract tension, and began to experience as a concrete and pressing question about what he actually wanted his existence to be. He resigned from the Volturi Guard. The process took longer than it should have, and was more complicated than he had hoped, and less catastrophic than he had feared. Aro received his resignation with the gracious and faintly menacing equanimity that was his signature response to things that displeased him, and the negotiation of the actual departure involved the kind of careful navigation that required everything Elizar had learned across centuries about managing conversations with people who held significantly more institutional power than he currently possessed. He was honest about his reasons without being more specific than necessary. He maintained throughout the absolute professionalism that had characterized his service, because he was not leaving in anger or contempt, was not performing a rejection of everything Volterra had been to him across the centuries, but simply arriving at the end of a chapter that had run its natural course. He walked out of Volterra and found Carmen, and they moved north together toward a reputation they had both heard about through the diffuse and sometimes unreliable channels through which information traveled in the vampire world. A coven of sisters in the Alaskan wilderness who had been living by a different philosophy than most of their kind for longer than most of their kind had been alive. Tanya received them with the careful warmth of someone assessing whether warmth was the appropriate response before committing to it fully, which was her way with everything significant. Kate had received them with the economy of someone who needed less information to reach a conclusion, because her conclusions were based on different and more direct evidence. Irina, who was younger in temperament than her years and more immediately open than her sisters, simply seemed glad of the new presence in the household, of additional voices in the long evenings and additional perspectives in the conversations that the Coven's relative isolation sometimes made repetitive. Elazar found in Denali something he had not fully understood he was looking for until he found it. A context in which his gift served something he could believe in completely. He knew what everyone in the Coven carried from his first moments among them, knew the specific textures of their abilities and qualities as clearly as he had ever known anything. He knew Tanya's particular perceptiveness, which operated below the threshold of formal designation, but which functioned as something real in practice. He knew Kate's gift with the precision of long familiarity with similar abilities across his centuries of assessment. He knew Irina's depth, which registered in the same awareness but as character rather than power, as the particular quality of someone for whom feeling was not something that happened to them, but something they inhabited completely. Carmen moved through the household with the ease of someone for whom belonging was a quality she carried internally rather than something she needed the environment to provide. She was interested in everyone and made each of them feel that her interests were specific to them rather than general, which it was. Carmen's interest in people was never generic, but always oriented toward the particular individual in front of her, the specific qualities and history and way of being in the world that made that person themselves, rather than a representative of a category. She brought to the Denali household a quality of warmth that was different from what was already there, not replacing anything but adding something, filling a specific register that had perhaps been slightly quieter than it might have been. When Renesmee came, Carmen's response was the most immediate and the most uncomplicated of anyone present, and its uncomplicated quality was itself a form of crucial evidence in the hours when uncertainty ran highest. She saw the child and loved her with the directness and completeness that characterized everything Carmen did, saw immediately what Renesmee was, rather than what the fear of what she might be suggested, and communicated her certainty with the quiet authority of someone who had no investment in any particular outcome except the true one. This mattered enormously in those first days. It mattered in the way that certainty always matters when it arrives in the middle of fear, offering a fixed point around which the uncertain can begin to organize. Elazar's contribution was different and equally necessary. He assessed Bella's gift and named it with the precision his centuries of assessment had produced, putting language to the shield that had been functioning without a name, giving everyone around him a clearer understanding of what was available to them as they prepared for the confrontation that was coming. This was what his gift did at its best and most honest. It converted uncertainty into knowledge, and knowledge was the precondition for everything that followed from it, for strategy and preparation, and the particular courage that comes from knowing what you are facing, rather than fearing what you cannot see clearly. What Elazar and Carmen had built together across the decades since Volterra was not a story that presented itself dramatically, did not have the quality of something requiring a narrative of crisis and transformation to account for its existence. It was simply the accumulation of two people choosing each other consistently across a very long time, adjusting to each other's qualities without requiring modification of them, building the particular knowledge of another person that sustained time and genuine attention produce. They disagreed about things, sometimes significantly, and resolved the disagreements with the quality of resolution available to people who are committed to each other's continued presence and who have enough time to actually finish the conversations they begin, rather than leaving them trailing in the face of daily urgency. They had found over the centuries that genuine disagreement, followed by genuine resolution, was one of the more reliable ways of actually knowing someone, of understanding not just who they were in comfortable circumstances, but who they were when something mattered and they had to navigate it. They had chosen the Denali Coven, and the Coven had chosen them, and the choosing had been renewed across every year of shared existence, until the distinction between the original members and the later arrivals had dissolved entirely into simply the family, which was what the Denali Coven was at its most essential level. Not a collection of individuals occupying the same territory for strategic reasons, not an alliance calculated for mutual benefit and maintained only as long as the benefits remained mutual. A family built from choice rather than birth, maintained by ongoing decision rather than obligation, oriented around values that each member had arrived at through their own reasoning and continued to hold as genuinely their own. Eleazar had left Volterra because the gap between what he saw and what he was required to do with what he saw had grown too wide to continue bridging by the mechanisms of professional discipline alone. He had found Carmen because she was someone whose clarity made his own clarity more possible, whose existence made the question of what his existence was for impossible to avoid asking honestly. He had found the Denali Coven because it was a place where what he carried and what he valued could exist in the same space without friction, where his gifts served understanding rather than acquisition, where the life he was living and the life he wanted to be living had finally, after a very long time, become the same life. He had been in Volterra extraordinarily useful to someone else's project. He was in Denali genuinely present in his own. The difference between those two states was not dramatic and did not require elaborate description. It was simply the difference between a life that belongs to you and a life that belongs to the structure you inhabit. And it was the difference that, in the long and honest accounting of an immortal existence, everything else eventually reduced to. Carmen had never explained this to him. She had simply been what she was, without modification or strategic deployment, and the truth of what that meant had been available to him from nearly the beginning, waiting with the patience of something that did not need to be pursued because it was not going anywhere. He had eventually been ready to see it clearly enough to act on it. In the long accounting of an immortal life, arriving at readiness before it was too late was all that was ever really required. Eleazar had made it, and the North had received him, and the life waiting on the other side of the one he had been living was exactly what he had not known he was looking for across the long centuries of looking. The aurora comes whether anyone is watching or not. This is one of the things that the North teaches. If you stay long enough and pay enough attention to receive the lesson, in the form it is actually offered, rather than the form you arrived expecting. The light moves across the sky in its ancient patterns, folding and dissolving and reforming in colors, that have no adequate names in any human language. And it does this with the complete indifference of something that has never needed an audience and has never had to. It was doing this before the first human looked up and felt the particular quality of wonder that such things produce. It will be doing it long after the last one. The Denali Coven has watched it for centuries, from the same territory, through the same long winters, and what the watching has taught them, what it teaches anyone who stays in one place long enough to receive it, is that beauty is not a performance. It simply is, and the witnessing of it is a gift that does not diminish the thing witnessed and does not require the witness to be anything in particular in order to receive it. The Denali Coven has been many things across its long existence. It has been a family in mourning and a family in recovery and a family in the slow, complicated process of becoming something more than the sum of its accumulated griefs. It has been a household of 3 and then of 5, reduced back toward 2 by a loss so specific and so unjust that the reduction has never fully stopped registering as wrong, as a subtraction that the arithmetic of the family cannot absorb without remainder. It has been the only other vegetarian coven in a world that regarded the choice as eccentric, the closest thing the Cullens had to counterparts. The proof that the life Carlyle had built was not an anomaly, but a possibility that others had arrived at independently through their own reasoning and their own losses. What it has always been, underneath all the other things it has been, is a testament to the power of chosen commitment. Every member of the Denali Coven chose to be there. Tanya chose the territory and called her sisters to it. Kate chose to come and chose to stay across centuries of having the alternative available. Irina chose the north in the particular way that fragile things choose what holds them, not because it was the strongest option, but because it was the truest one. Elizar chose to leave the structure that had defined his existence for centuries and walk towards something smaller and less powerful and infinitely more his own. Carmen chose to be exactly what she was in the presence of someone who needed to see what that looked like, and then chose to follow him north toward a household that needed what she had to give. None of these choices were without cost. This is important to carry forward into the quiet of wherever you are as you receive this story. The understanding that the Denali Coven's particular kind of goodness was not the goodness of people for whom goodness was easy. It was the goodness of people who knew precisely what it cost and paid it anyway, again and again, across the kind of time span that makes most human concepts of commitment look brief. The vegetarian diet cost them every day. The staying cost them the freedom of the nomadic life that most of their kind lived. The loving of humans and the losing of humans cost Tanya something she replenished only through the deep reserves of a character that refused, across centuries of evidence that might have justified the refusal, to stop believing that loving was worth what it took from you. Sasha is in all of it. She is in the commitment to the diet, which grew from the roots of her death and the grief of it, and the question of what surviving her required of the people she had loved. She is in the way the sisters hold each other, with a particular attentiveness of people who understand from direct and devastating experience that presence is not guaranteed and should not be taken for granted. She is in the north itself, in the choice to come here and stay here, rather than continuing the nomadic drift that had preceded her loss as though the fixity of the territory was a way of being the kind of people she had believed them capable of becoming. She did not survive to see what they became, but what they became grew directly from the soil of having loved her and lost her. And there is a way in which everything that Denali Coven is can be traced back to a woman who loved too much and whose loving, even in its catastrophic expression, produced something worth producing. Irina is in all of it too. Her absence is present in the way that absences are present when the people who are gone were woven into the fabric of daily existence across long enough that the fabric retains the shape of them even after they are no longer filling it. Tanya reaches sometimes toward a conversation she cannot have. Kate feels sometimes the particular quality of the household's emotional register and notes the specific frequency that is no longer there, the one that belonged to the sister who felt everything the most. The North holds Irina's absence the way it holds everything, without judgment, without the pressure toward resolution that grief sometimes encounters from people who are uncomfortable with its duration, simply as a fact of the landscape, present and acknowledged, and neither required to be explained nor to be overcome. The coven that remains is not diminished exactly. This is the complicated truth of survival, the thing that feels almost disloyal to say and is nonetheless true. The people who remain after loss do not simply become smaller versions of what they were before it. They become different. They carry new weight and new knowledge, and the particular quality of sight that only comes from having looked directly at the worst and remained standing afterward. Tanya and Kate are not lesser for having lost Irina. They are marked by it, shaped by it, changed in ways that are permanent and ways that are still changing. And the coven they continue to build in the aftermath of her absence is built with a specific knowledge of what can be taken and what cannot. What cannot be taken is the choosing. This is the deepest thing that Denali Coven's long history offers to anyone paying sufficient attention to receive it. The Volturi can destroy a member. Time can take the humans who are loved. Grief can narrow a person's vision until they see something other than what is actually in front of them. And the consequences of that narrowed vision can be as final as anything more deliberately malicious. All of these things have happened to the Denali Coven and will perhaps happen again, because that is the nature of an existence long enough to encompass the full range of what existence contains. But the choosing continues. Every morning, or what passes for morning in a household where no one sleeps, where night and day are distinguished more by the light through the glass walls than by any internal rhythm that demands the distinction. Every new period of the endless present that immortal life inhabits, the members of the Denali Coven choose again. They choose the diet, which is never easy. They choose the territory, which is theirs not by accident, but by sustained intention. They choose each other, which is the most fundamental and the most renewable of all the choices available to anyone who has ever decided that some people are worth the difficulty of staying. The mountain does not care about any of this. Denali rises above the tree line and above the clouds and above the reach of everything human or vampire or any other category of being that has ever lived in its shadow. And it rises with the indifference of something so old that the concept of caring is simply not applicable to it. The sisters chose it for this quality among others. There is a specific kind of comfort available only from things that are genuinely indifferent to your significance, not unkind, not hostile, simply so much larger than you and your concerns that proximity to them produces a useful recalibration of scale. Whatever the Denali Coven has lost, and whatever it carries, and whatever it is still in the process of becoming, the mountain was there before all of it, and will be there after. This is not a consolation exactly. It is a context. And context, for beings who have lived long enough to understand how much difference it makes, is not a small thing. The caribou still move across the tundra in their ancient patterns, following routes that predate every human or vampire presence in this territory by thousands of years. The wolves still range through their territories with the assurance of animals who have never had reason to doubt that the land belongs to them. The salmon still run in the rivers in late summer, and the bears still fish them with the unhurried confidence of something that has been doing this for as long as anything has been doing anything here. The land continues its own long life, indifferent to the smaller lives that move across its surface, and the Denali Coven continues its own long life within that larger indifference, finding in the scale of the natural world a perspective that the smaller human world, with its compressed timelines and its urgent concerns, cannot provide. This is where the story of the Denali Coven rests, not in conclusion. Immortal stories do not conclude. They simply arrive at a point where the telling pauses. But in continuity, in the fact of the northern lights moving overhead in their ancient patterns, in the fact of two sisters who have survived everything and are still here, still choosing, still carrying the people they have loved in the interior spaces where the living dead continue to matter, in the fact of a man who walked out of a dark place toward a lighter one and found it was everything the dark place was not, and a woman whose clarity made his clarity possible, in the fact that the choosing is renewable, that every day the Denali Coven exists is another day they have decided to be what they have decided to be, and that this decision, repeated across centuries and through every kind of loss and grief and difficulty that the world has offered them, is not a small or an easy or an unremarkable thing. It is, in fact, everything. So let that settle around you now, dreamer, as the north settles into its long quiet. Let the aurora move across the sky above you in colors that have no names. Let the mountain stand in its ancient indifference and offer you its particular comfort, the comfort of something so much larger than your concerns, that your concerns, held next to it, become briefly and mercifully small. The Denali Coven watches from their glass house in the wilderness, and they are still here, and what they have built across the long span of their choosing is still standing, and the north holds all of it with the patience of something that has been holding things for a very long time and has not yet found the limit of what it can contain. Rest now. The story has found its resting place, and in the long quiet of the Alaskan night, in the shadow of the great mountain, beneath the light that needs no audience, everything that was lost and everything that remained and everything that was chosen in the space between those two things continues, gently and without urgency, into whatever comes next. Good night.